audience. I think we're in for an incredible evening with two of the most distinguished people who have been involved in Russia and Russia-American relations for all of their careers, going back to academic work and through all kinds of experiences, both in policy formulation and being ambassador and being key members of a number of research institutions, organizations across the country, and important ones both in university and outside of university and foundations and in the public sector and in the government to work on the issue that is, as all of you know, I continue to say, is central to our very existence. I still believe this is an existential relationship, Russia and America, because of what we know about both of these nations that have had such a long and complicated relationship. It is our great pleasure to welcome you to the Southern Center for International Studies, and on behalf of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, who is sponsoring this whole process of bringing our guests here tonight. So we thank them for that. Our first guest, which we will ask to speak, and they can decide which order. The way we'll do it is have them make some preliminary remarks, both about the process that they're engaged in, as well as some general first comments. But as you know, before I introduce them, I would say, as we put this is an opportunity and a fact gathering or opinion gathering or question gathering process that this group, the Working Project on Russia-American Relations that Bob Legvold, Dr. Legvold is heading as chair, and Ambassador Collins is one of the key members of the steering committee of that very large project to gather information both from the expert community, from both sides of the governmental divide, both Russian and America, and finally from you, from citizens in America, in open forum to discuss this most essential relationship that has had such an impact on how we think about ourselves and even how, and certainly how we go forward in the future. The process is such that it is an ongoing one. There have been papers written, and a number of institutions around the country have been engaged in these kinds of conversations, at least in my mind, and I know a number of the people involved in other projects under other auspices. But I think what you will see, and I want to say this up front just to put in my word from knowing Ambassador Collins not so long, but Robert Legvold for a very long time. We're very fortunate in the United States to have a group of people who have been working in Russian-American relations through ill times and good times, through tough times, and for over the decades, to really think seriously and deeply, and I would say humanely, about how we can operate in the circumstance of a rivalry, in the circumstance of a potential cooperation, in the potential situation in which the two countries have to work out some kind of way to get along, because the alternative is just too horrible to think about as we've come up to this stage. But to congratulate and appreciate both Ambassador Collins and Dr. Robert Legvold's long-time work on being serious and deep thinking about what we need to do in this relationship, and to be a part of that group of Americans and Russians who work on this relationship in a constant and professional way. Ambassador James Collins comes to us in this iteration as Director of Russia and Eurasia Program for the Carnegie Endowment. I won't go into all of the qualifications. You've seen the biography, only to say he was ambassador to Moscow and to Russia in the last decade and the early part of this decade. He's also been engaged in various roles throughout his career in the area. And currently serves, as I said, in this particular group that is studying thoroughly this relationship. And Dr. Robert Legvold, who is just retired, I guess emeritus now, but Marshall Schulman professor in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University, and now is, of course, chair of this project, this important project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. If we tried to go through publications and commentaries and presentations over the years, the list would be so long we'd be here for 3 hours and a half just going through both of these gentlemen's credentials. I don't think we need to do it. Their words and commentary and insights will speak for themselves. And so with that, I would like to call on Bob Legvold as chair of the project to set us up for the evening and set up a really good exchange on this great subject that's before us tonight.
Wayne, thank you. That's very generous, and it's very generous of you to organize the event, give us a chance to meet with you people this evening. It's a pleasure to be back in Atlanta. Wayne is a friend of more than 20 years now, and this is exactly the kind of audience that we're interested in reaching 3 constituencies that have been important to us with this project that goes back to last spring, last April. It's not something we've created only in the last few months or since the last national election in the United States. The first audience is a new administration, and we didn't know what the new administration would be when we began this project. The second is the U.S. Congress. The third is the outside world, you people, and within it the media. And we've been now in major cities, Atlanta being one of them, over the last month. Last week or week before last, Jim and I were in Los Angeles. We've been in Seattle, we've been in Chicago, San Francisco, Houston. Each of these occasions we've also tried to meet with the board of editors for the major newspapers. And as a parenthetical comment, one of the sad stories, sign of the times, when we reached out to the Atlanta Journal Constitution this last week to set up that meeting, the new editor of the new chairman of the board of editors for the newspaper, Andre Jackson, wrote back somewhat wistfully, and he said, you know, we've had to reduce the staff so much that we no longer will have anyone on the editorial board that writes about international affairs. It's a sign of the times. But it also means that for us and for you, if you're engaged in trying to reach out across the media, you with the Southern Center, Wayne, we really now do need to think about different media by which we're going to reach audiences, stimulate discussion, which is one of our purposes in doing the Russia project. The times are right. And there are 3 good reasons why I think the work of organizations like ours and sister institutions, because a number of them are doing similar work, to rethink U.S. policy toward Russia, and I'll give you 3 of them. The first I call the imperative, and the imperative for doing it comes in 2 parts. The first part is the deterioration in U.S.-Russia relations over the last 8 years, almost 10 years now, which has been serious and in many ways illogical. We understand the precise reasons for it. They revolve around questions of the U.S. decision to deploy ballistic missile in Central Europe, or there's the issue of NATO enlargement, particularly the question of Georgia and Ukraine and NATO enlargement, or it's Russian behavior and what Putin has done within Russia or what it's done to its neighbors in cutting off gas on Ukraine. So there are all kinds of very specific things that are part of the deterioration. But if you ask yourself the question at a very basic level and compare the situation with the Soviet Union, the other superpower in a nuclear world during the Cold War, there's no logical reason why we should be in the condition that we're in today, and that we couldn't have handled those other more specific problems in a different way. We shouldn't be where we are. And a lot of people in the outside world, thoughtful people, especially in the policy world, I think a year ago began realizing that. Said, let's go back and think about this issue again. The second part of why it's imperative is the way we took the snapshot of Russia in the early 1990s, and the snapshot that we got is inappropriate at this point. The world is a different place from the first 2 years after the end of the Cold War. All of you in the room know that. I don't need to rehearse the way in which the world is different in 2009 from the way it was even in 1999, let alone in 1991. And within it, Russia is a very different actor. This is no longer a country that it's on its knees with a tin cup going out in order to get help to finance its London and its Paris debt. That's unconcerned about whether or not it can hold things together on the inside of the country. It's obviously worried about the impact of the current economic crisis, but it's a very different actor from before. The second reason is the importance of Russia. I think one of the major failings of U.S. policy going back to the Bush Senior administration and through the Clinton years, and then through the Bush years, and potentially still a failure unless the Obama administration will face it, is an inability to identify just how large the stakes are that we have in the relationship with Russia, persuade themselves of what the stakes are, and then share them with us so that all of us recognize the importance of getting this relationship right. Because this isn't a secondary, it certainly isn't a tertiary relationship in international politics. Bill Burns, the Undersecretary of State, a terrific voice on this issue and a key policymaker in Washington, in a speech 2 weeks ago, said that there is no country in the world that affects more U.S. national interests, that is across a wider board, more ramified set of interests than Russia. And he's right. Everyone in this room knows that it starts with nuclear weapons, because our two countries still have 95% of them. And therefore, whatever happens to the way these weapons are managed, or whatever progress we make toward dealing with a nuclear nonproliferation regime that is now in danger of, if not dissolving, then of being seriously damaged, depends on Russia. And I think many in this room, you may not know the percentage, but you know that Russia is important as an energy player. 30% of the world's gas sits atop the energy grid by which all of the energy, oil and gas from the post-Soviet space, reaches the outside world. Key allies, such as the Europeans, heavily dependent on Russia for that energy. But you may not recognize that Russia is critical to us if we're going to have a successful UN conference on climate change in Copenhagen at the end of the year, because the United States, China, and Russia emit 45% of the greenhouse gases in the world. And unless these three countries work together and do something in this area, there won't be progress in this area. Or take something like the Arctic, which is now in its resources exposed because of climate change, which is opening the waterways. The estimates are between 13 and 20% of the world's hydrocarbon reserves are in the Arctic. And the Russians are rushing rather aggressively and assertively to claim those resources, at least a significant portion of it, and then militarizing those claims. And the outside world is nervous, the Canadians, the Americans, the Brits, the others, and we are responding in kind. I think very few Americans are focused on what kind of a problem we can have over the Arctic in the near term. And that just begins the parade of ways in which Russia matters to us, and why we need to focus on that agenda in a way that will allow us to deal with these potential problems constructively rather than destructively. The third reason why attention is turned in this direction among people like Jim and myself and our colleagues and those in other projects is opportunity. The first was imperative, the second is the importance of the issue itself, and the third is opportunity. We've had a change in national leadership in both countries. The Russians got a new president in somewhat complicated circumstances that still leave Putin in a very important position within Russia as prime minister, but a change of leadership that is beginning to make a difference with Medvedev as president, and in particular on the U.S. side. And here the U.S. side is important because most of us have believed in our project that nothing is really going to happen to change the trajectory of the last 10 years unless the U.S. takes the initiative. The skepticism, the sourness, the cynicism on the Russian side about what can and can't happen, what the Americans are up to, what the pressures are in American society, Obama notwithstanding, are so large that unless the lead is taken by the Obama administration, which is what has happened in these first months, change won't occur, and they will continue to have to exercise the lead. We're only now, I think, beginning to get some sign that the Russian leadership, at least portions of it, are entertaining the idea that the Obama administration is serious about trying to change things and may be able to make some changes, and therefore they have to begin paying a little more attention to what their role will be. But they're not there yet. And one of the critical tests, a promising first step, was the meeting between the two presidents in London in April. But the real test will be what it is they're able to report to all of us when they meet in July to see where they are with the relationship. I promised Wayne that my opening comments before we turn to Jim would be no more than 10 minutes. The last point I would make in sticking to that is to say a word about the task, which in the end also then involves your stake in how well it gets done, not just within the administration, but within groups on the outside, such as ours, within the think tanks around the country, within the specialist community. Beyond the practical steps that the U.S. government and the Russians in response need to take to begin reversing the trend of the last 10 years, we can talk about that in the conversation, what is happening, what needs to happen. I think there are two other major challenges that are particularly appropriate for those of us on the outside to wrestle with because they're large enough, time-consuming enough that governments under the pressure of next Tuesday's emergency really don't have time to do. It's one of the advantages of our society that we have groups that can do this kind of thing. The first of those is developing a strategic vision for the U.S.-Russia relationship. And one of the things we've been arguing for in the project is, and others have as well, the Obama administration needs to, at some point, beyond simply doing the constructive thing around strategic arms control or around the Iran problem or Afghanistan, needs to ask themselves the following question. Where do we want the U.S.-Russia relationship to be 5 years from now? Where do we want it to be? What do we want it to look like? And then how would we get there? If the president gives a speech or key figures within the administration where they begin laying out this strategic vision, then I will say they really have taken the second critical step beyond the kind of progress that I said we need to see, whether it's reported or not, in July in Moscow when the two are together. But, and this is the last point, in this context it won't be easy to do that, or even in general, to transform U.S. policy to Russia in the present environment because it occurs in the context in which it's not just a question of rethinking U.S. policy toward Russia. We're in the process of rethinking U.S. foreign policy. So this is an important piece of that process, and you see it going on when the president engages Iran, or when we begin developing an alternative policy in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or when you see what's going on with Cuba, or whatever will come in terms of China. So this is a moving piece within a set of moving pieces. And that leads to the second part of it. Working out relations with Russia in this context means that they have to also be worked out in the larger context of how we're addressing key issues. You can't deal with the question of Russia's role, for example, in redoing the international financial architecture now that Bretton Woods and everything else has failed in the contemporary context, whether it's in a G20 context or a G7, G8 context. You can't solve the Russian role in this other than in the context of the way in which the international financial architecture is going to be redone and what the role of the G20 or alternative institutions will be. The same thing is true in terms of the Iran problem and the Russia role in dealing with Iran and its nuclear weapons program. I don't think in the end, this is my own view, I'm not sure where Jim is on the issue, I don't think on the question of Iran nuclear weapons and the Russian help that we want in dealing with that it can be done in a decoupled or disembodied fashion. I think it has to be in the context of what kind of a deal we're going to negotiate with Iran in general, what the E3, the European powers, and we are offering to Iran in this context, because it isn't, in my view, going to be the deal that's currently on the table. And the deal that's finally offered has to make sense in terms of the framework that we will begin developing on the way to the 2010 Nuclear Nonproliferation Review Conference. In short, what will work for Iran is going to have to work for the entire international context as an increasing number of countries in the nuclear renaissance begin developing domestic nuclear power, and therefore implicitly the capacity to enrich uranium that conceivably could be the basis for a weapons program. Same thing is true in terms of Afghanistan. We're in the process now of deciding how we're going to go about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and what sets of coalitions we need to deal with it, what strategies we need to follow. You can't work out Russia's role on the issue of Afghanistan other than partially and separately until we've begun to figure out how that fits into the larger policy. Well, I've said enough. Jim will add more. The only other thing that I would point out for you in the materials that you have out front, one is a good illustration of what other sister organizations are doing, because a lot of work is being done now, not just the American Academy of Arts and Science Project. One of those is the Hagel-Hart Commission report, Senators Charles Hagel and Gary Hart, and the commission they had. And incidentally, Jim was on that commission, as was Tom Pickering and Tom Graham, who are also part of our steering committee. And then an essay by Tom Graham, who was the senior person on Russia in the last administration, the Bush administration. But the other thing is this item, for those of you that really want to follow what's going on in the field, it's the website that we have at the American Academy. And in our effort to promote everybody's work, you'll find links on the right-hand side to everything that you can find to read about this. So if you want to go into much greater depth on what some of these ideas are, you'll find it there, and the reference to the website when you're at your computer and on your internet will be there. So if that's of interest to you, you might want to pick that up. Jim?
Well, let me also say thank you for coming this evening. I think one of the most rewarding things I've done over the years of my government service and then afterward is really talking outside Washington, because you get some good questions and you get some common sense. I want to talk to you about three questions tonight that are really more specifically focused on trying to sort of make sense of where we are at this moment with Russia, with development of a potentially more productive and effective policy toward that country. And the three questions are the following. I mean, first of all, is there any objective reason to think that things are going to be any different today from what they were 6 months ago? That has relevance, I think, if you are trying to make policy, because if your former fellows basically were dealing with a set of circumstances the same as you've got, it limits what you may be able to do. The second one is, are we on any kind of a right track in terms of what's happened in the last 3 to 4 months? And what is that track? What does it look like? And then finally, the question is, have we really accomplished anything yet? Or is there any reason to think that we have any sort of momentum or direction or whatever put in place? Let me take the objective sort of context realities first. I submit that it is a different world. Bob has already alluded to some elements of that, but it is also a particularly important fact to realize that the world has really changed extraordinarily for the Russian leadership and for the Russian people over the last 6 months. And there are three things today that are really shaping the context of contemporary Russia as we have to deal with it and the relationship. The first is that this is no longer Putin's Russia. Whatever people may have been writing about when Putin left office and became prime minister, asserting that it was just Putin redux with a fellow there that somebody called a president, I think is just not real today. It seems to me a fair point to assert that Russia today has a sort of dual leadership. No one fully understands how it works, and who's up and who's down is the favorite parlor game in Moscow on any given evening. The fact of the matter is both of them are in office, and both of them are exercising authority. And that means that unlike in the previous administration of Mr. Putin, where it was very clear there was one man and one decision maker for key issues, this time there is some kind of a balanced operation with competing, I think, visions of where Russia should be going and how it should develop. Now, nobody knows exactly how this works. Nobody knows exactly what the implications are. But one thing seems to be true, and that is that there is, in comparison to the last administration of President Putin, a more a greater openness to the idea that Russia has to find a new stage, a new capacity to modernize itself, to make itself into something more than just a recovered post-Soviet state. Now, the second reason is that the economic crisis has changed life very dramatically for almost every Russian citizen. Life is very different if you are making the federal budget for the Russian Federation and you have $150 a barrel oil than it is when you have $40 a barrel oil and basically are going to run a deficit. So, frankly, what you've had in the last 6 months is an economy that has gone from a pace of 6-7% growth of gross domestic product annually to what looks like this year a 6% decline. Now that means there's a 15% change, and that is a big, big change on people's lives, on the business activity, and most importantly on factors like employment. So there's a great concern now that much of the recovery, much of the progress that was made in the last 6-7 years is at risk. And that many of those who thought life was becoming more stable, more predictable, and better are now not so sure. And this has made things much more sober, it seems to me, for the leadership in Moscow, and has made them much more nervous. And I would submit it has also made them much more open to the idea that they are, as in some sense, experiencing the first ever Russian capitalist crisis in a century. They are now finding themselves part of this broader world and are beginning to see that in order to get through it, you have to work within the context of this broader world. And that may have positive implications. And the third factor that's new is that we have a new administration. I think Bob has alluded to some of the facts surrounding a quite different approach to policy. I think Mr. Obama's approach so far vis-a-vis Russia is very consistent with the kind of approach he has outlined for how he is approaching everything from Iran to Cuba to many of these others. And so I agree. We are now in a context of a different kind of approach to protecting and advancing American interests. I think we're looking at leadership globally in a different way. And I think this has opened up a different kind of context for the relations of Russia and the United States to develop. Now, I would therefore submit that there is a difference now from what we've gone through over the last 6-7 years in a number of key ways that open up, as Bob mentioned, a time of opportunity. Now, regarding the second question, where are we? Well, I think, as Bob has indicated, for several months before the election and then on into the formation of the new administration and over the last few months, many of the people who have been thinking about Russian policy or bemoaning it or however you want to look at it over the last few years have thought that there were certain things and certain elements that needed to be present in a successful policy. Those are in many of these papers that Bob has mentioned. They are on to be available on the website. But broadly speaking, what it, I think, meant was that we do need a strategic vision of Russia. We also need to engage Russia on the real agenda we have with the country, which is, as Bob said, a very, very broad one. And it runs from strategic nuclear weapons to what do we do about nuclear proliferation, down to what do we do about visas. And it is a comprehensive, and I can tell you, a very complicated agenda. And when I was ambassador, I had 29 government agencies at my embassy, all of them beavering away on the American taxpayer's business. And there are probably going to be more without much doubt in the future. Strategic vision and dealing with the agenda realistically was a key element of what people were recommending. The second was, you can't do it just by meeting every 6 months at the presidential level. That you had to find a better and more structured form of engagement that would put our two governments together to work practically at resolving issues. Issues like, how are we going to work with the Russians to make sure the space station can be serviced when we can't fly the shuttle anymore? Or how are we going to deal with things like communicable diseases? Everything from nuclear issues, nuclear proliferation, the traditional Cold War agenda, all the way down through what has now become a globalized agenda, is now very much a part of the Russian reality and our relationship with the Russian state. And we need to get on with restoring the capacity to talk about these things effectively. And the third was to define the agenda. You know, well, okay, what are the priorities? One of my problems as ambassador was I used to get things from Washington every morning. I'd get a stack of telegrams like that, and all of them were first priority. Well, that cannot work. First of all, it completely confuses our partners because they haven't got a clue what's important. And you have to have some capacity in the government in Washington and in our own political system to set some priorities, stick with them, and then pursue them in an effective way. Now, I think in that sense that the early months of the Obama administration have been pretty successful. I would encourage you, if you haven't done it, to read the statement that came out of London when the two presidents met. It did, I think, three important things. First of all, it really did change the atmosphere. It said, we're here not to act as though the Cold War hasn't ended. It has. We're here to look for a way to have a more productive relationship. And we're here as pragmatic leaders who are ready not to look at each other in ideological terms, but basically to try to deal with issues on our agenda in a productive and effective way. We will not always agree. We have to manage differences, but we also have to find ways to cooperate that are practical. The second point that was made was a lengthy agenda. It specified certainly the nuclear arms reduction talks that needed to get started, and they have started. And so that's been a fairly successful statement. But it talked at some length about how we will approach the issues of nuclear proliferation. Then it got into a series of economic and commercial issues. Here, the fundamental thrust was, how can we do something to ensure that the economic base for our relationship is serious? Right now, or historically over the last several years, the trade with Russia bilaterally is about the same as with Guatemala. Now, this is not the kind of economic back and forth, investment, trade, and so forth in a relationship that is going to act as sufficient balance and sort of influence to, I would say, make people think twice before they run off on some tangent. And we need to develop a stronger, more integrated and effective economic base. There were a number of issues on the agenda that they outlined that were designed to do that, and one hopes that that's to be done. And the third area they talked about was the need to do more simply to have our two societies, not in the private sector and not in government, but the rest, be more actively engaged with each other, whether it's science and technology exchanges, students, NGO activities, nonprofit work, and so forth. that there is a need to sort of normalize this as a regular thing that is done without great fanfare, but also is seen as important in bringing the two societies to a more productive relationship. And finally, they made the point, much satisfaction to me as an ex-government bureaucrat, that we really do need to think about structuring the relationship, that it can't just be left to presidential meetings every few months, as I mentioned. It's going to have some kind of a systemic institutional base to manage it. So I thought they did a very good job in London. I think if you were to ask, out of all of these studies and recommendations and all of us telling the new president what to do, he listened. It was basically, I would say, a very positive and forthcoming and hopeful set of ideas and agenda and so forth that came out of the London statement. And then they went home. Now, the question is, and this is I will briefly try to give you a sense of the third question. Now what? Are we going to be able to turn these reasonably good sentiments and change of atmosphere that took place in London into something sufficiently tangible to make the meeting in July and afterward acquire a degree of momentum in building a new kind of relationship? And I think the answer to that question is we don't know. We don't know yet. We've made a good start on a few things. The strategic arms agreement negotiations are underway. I believe we will have a follow-on to the start, the strategic arms reduction treaty before it expires at the end of the year. It'll be high drama and, the usual last-minute negotiations, but we'll get there. And that's good. I know that our people concerned with Russia officially in the government are also working very hard on defining approaches to an agenda and defining certain outcomes that they would like to see and beginning to contact the Russians on trying to get those in place by the time the two presidents meet in July. But it's early innings. We don't know how this is going to work. One encouraging thing is that the business community is going to have its own meeting. Private business associations on both sides are going to meet when the presidents are in Moscow. And that has some hope to make movement possible on finding new ways to be more active in the investment and trade areas and broaden this economic base. Other questions that are economic are also political, whether we will manage to take the lead in getting Russia into the World Trade Organization, something that's long overdue, and probably isn't going to happen unless we take that lead. Whether we'll get rid of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which is an irritant of little practical consequence but political symbolism. We don't know yet. And finally, we don't have the structure yet, and we don't have a good sense for whether or not many of these other areas, everything from public health cooperation to student exchanges and so on, really are going to get an impetus and a commitment to strengthen the support they have out of this coming couple of 3 months before the presidents meet. I hope they will. I think it's very important that they do. I think the agenda that's outlined has been effective, and it's a good one. But I also, out of my own experience, am very leery of large declarations and big statements. I am much more concerned that we find coming out of the meeting of the two presidents in July some very tangible and practical projects and areas of cooperation which will show practical results to both populations. If we do that, I believe we will have generated a certain momentum that can carry us to a better relationship. If we don't do it, I think that there's a great danger that we can easily slide back to, at a minimum, sort of glaring at each other on both sides of a fence and engaging sometimes positively, sometimes confrontationally, just depending on the whim of events. Now, I don't think that's the way to direct or lead a policy, and I hope we won't see it. So I will leave it at that, and I think we ought to then just have a discussion with the audience. I am cautiously optimistic.